Hi, everybody. It's Dr. Briant back again today with you for more afternoon tea and truth biscuits. Thank you so much for coming back to my regular viewers. And for all of you who've been sharing and subscribing, really grateful to have growing numbers of people following the show. And don't forget to drop your thoughts and your questions into the chat while you're watching. It's always great to get those impromptu questions. On this show, we talk a lot about propaganda. So the attempt to sort of deliberately shape a group of people's thoughts, feelings, behavior with media forms or communications of some kind to achieve a particular aim or outcome in the world, usually political or related to a conflict. My guest today is going to talk with me about just why this kind of thing matters so much. So we're going to be talking about the erosion of our freedom to think and threats to this really important sanctity of our minds and our ability to be, individual in our thoughts and, make sure we can think independently. Susie Alegre, my guest today, is a senior fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation. She's an international human rights lawyer who has worked on some of the most challenging legal and policy issues of our time relating to digital age human rights. In particular, she works on security, privacy, disinformation, and neurotechnologies, and has an incredible new book, which I've been reading out. Unfortunately, I have a digital copy, so here it is.
I've got a copy here.
You can wave that around. Thank you, Susie. I highly recommend the book. It's really good, really engaging and interesting to read. I mean, this stuff is absolutely fascinating. And it's the most interesting thing I've read on the subject of the kind of Cambridge Analytica debate around surveillance propaganda and how it's being targeted at us. So I think, especially because it's so going into these kinds of theoretical ideas of why this is so important to us in our lives, and thinking about how we can actually respond to this in terms of like policy and the way that it's developed across history as well. So her book is called Freedom to Think: The Long Struggle to Liberate Our Minds. And we're going to be exploring some of these really important themes on the show today with Susie. So Susie, welcome.
Thank you.
It's really great to have you on, especially as I'm reading this book. It's amazing. You start the book by talking about, it's a wonderful anecdote about, how our generation, I suppose, had the ability to forget and leave our past behind us. And, we did all sorts of cool things that maybe, were a part of history and actually and then forgot about them until we picked up the photo that was in the album many years later. And most people don't know about these things and so on. So we have this ability to leave our past behind that, nowadays the new generations are unable to forget what's happened to them. Young people of tomorrow are surveilled from the womb, as you point out, which is really quite a shocking thought. So what first got you interested in privacy and surveillance as issues?
I suppose my background is as a generalist human rights lawyer, and an awful lot of the time that I've been working on human rights, I was working on human rights and counterterrorism. And obviously, surveillance is a really big issue when you're looking at security and counterterrorism. Mm-hmm. So is propaganda and, what amounts to hate speech and all of these sort of issues that we see today. Yes. in the debates in the digital space. But I suppose I started looking at them before really this sort of concept of surveillance capitalism, as Shoshana Zuboff calls it, came about. And so I was used to working on privacy, looking at limitations on the way the state can look at what we're doing, and also looking at from the sort of countering violent extremism perspective, how states were increasingly wanting to understand how people thought and to prevent them then acting on what might be extremist thoughts, prevent that sort of slide from thinking about something to terrorist activity. And so I've been looking at those issues and also looking at how states also sort of control borders and surveillance in border zones. But for me, the thing that really sort of lit the light bulb, if you like, on this particular issue was the first time I read about Cambridge Analytica. It was in an article in early 2017, before it became sort of front page news and the Cambridge Analytica scandal. I read about it in a small article. It was originally published in German, I think, but I read the English translation, talking about this idea of behavioral micro-targeting in political campaigns. So using the information gathered through our data to understand on an individual level what voters are thinking, what kind of people they are, how they're feeling, and then using that information to go in and press their psychological buttons in order to make them behave in one way or another, not necessarily to change their political opinions, but maybe make them less bothered to get up and vote if they're not going to vote the way you want them to, that sort of thing. And so when I read about it, like I say, it was a real light bulb moment that I sat there and I thought, but this isn't just data protection. This isn't just privacy. This is about the right to freedom of thought. This is about our autonomy, our ability to make our own decisions for ourselves. And for me, while I could talk the talk on privacy, and I'd written, countless papers about the importance of privacy, this felt viscerally personal. And it was the thing that really made me sit up and go, oh my God, something has to be done. Yes, and why is nobody doing anything? And so that was the trigger for me to set off on this journey. So it was sort of since early 2017, I started developing these ideas that actually the right to freedom of thought is the key question here. And that privacy and data protection are absolutely vital because they are gateway rights. They are the gateway to our minds. And that's why they are so important in the digital age.
Wow, yes. Actually, that leads us to my next question very nicely. I wanted to ask you, what is the freedom to think? Why does the privacy of our minds in particular matter so much?
Well, the right to freedom of thought and the closely related right to freedom of opinion are protected in international human rights law. Freedom of thought is protected under, for example, Article 18 of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, alongside freedom of conscience, religion, and belief. Whereas freedom of opinion is protected under Article 19 alongside freedom of expression and freedom of information. So you see these two rights kind of working together, if you like. Both of those rights have a sort of internal and an external aspect. So, we believe whatever we like, but then we manifest that belief by going to church or praying, whatever it is. We have whatever opinions going on inside our heads and we express those opinions. And that's when we're talking about freedom of speech, freedom of expression. But that internal aspect of the right and the external aspect of the rights are dealt with quite differently. So that inner aspect is what's known as the forum internum, and it's essentially our inner lives. And the way that's protected in human rights law is really quite special. It's this protection of the inner realm is what's called an absolute right. Most rights can be limited or qualified. So freedom of expression, yes, you can say what you like, but you're going to have to take the consequences. And if what you're saying amounts to hate speech, then you no longer have the right to say it, and there may be obligations to shut that down. Or if you're saying something that violates someone else's rights, then your speech can be restricted. Absolute rights, by contrast, can never be limited for any reason. And there are very few of them in international human rights law. There is this right to freedom in the forum internum. Yeah. And then there is the prohibition on torture and the prohibition on slavery. And I think if you think of those three kind of key absolute rights together, they really go to the heart of what it means to be human and human dignity. But the other thing about absolute rights, and the reason why some rights are protected absolutely, is because if they're interfered with, the consequences go so deep and are so that you can't correct. The impact on both an individual and on society is so profound that it sort of undoes our humanity, if you like. And that's why they're protected so absolutely. And I think, if you think about your own inner life and the difference between what goes on inside your head and what you might want to share with other people, it gives you that space to decide how to behave, what to say, what to share, how to adapt yourself to the situation around you.
That's amazing. So we hear an awful lot about the freedom of speech, yes, especially like at the moment there's a lot of debates in the United States about, First Amendment rights and the big tech companies and things like this, and whether or not that is, of course, in the specifics of the US Constitution. Perhaps it's not something that's protected, but whether or not it should be somehow in keeping with this First Amendment principle to, protect speech on these platforms is a really thorny issue at the moment. But we don't really hear much about that freedom to think. How do you think that these technologies really go so far as to violate that? And do you think we've got complacent about this particular right?
Yeah, I think one of the reasons we don't hear about it, and I when I first started to look at it, I was asking myself this question: why don't we hear about the right to freedom of thought? I think one of the reasons is, and again in US jurisprudence, American justices have said, of course, the right to freedom of thought is, it's a natural right and it's an absolute right by its nature, but that no one can actually interfere with your freedom of thought. No one can actually get inside your head. No government can get inside your head. But this assumption that no one and nothing can ever get inside your head, if it was ever true, I think can certainly not be described as being true today. But one of the reasons why the right to freedom of thought was included, in the Universal Declaration on Human Rights and in international human rights treaties was that in the aftermath of the Second World War, the obvious tragic impact of Nazi propaganda, for example, it was clear that actually our thoughts can be manipulated. People can get inside our heads, and they can do that en masse with really devastating consequences. But one of the things that I found when I started looking at technology, and, if we take that Cambridge Analytica example or the behavioral micro-targeting, whether or not they can do what they say, what they're offering is to go inside individual people's heads and rearrange the furniture. That is what they're selling. So either it's false advertising, or it's a, it's a direct way of getting inside and manipulating in our heads. And what I found when I was researching the book was that increasingly the big driver and the big direction of travel of technological innovation today is precisely about that. That's what it's for. That's why data is valuable, is this idea that data is going to give the key to our minds. So, whether or not
we even act on it.
Exactly, absolutely. And so I think there is this question now that it's almost what's written on the tin. What's written on the tin of tech innovation is the promise of getting inside our heads, knowing what we're thinking, predicting how we might behave, and altering it. Mm-hmm. So we have to really take that very seriously. And the right to freedom of thought, in my view, is a very strong legal and philosophical tool for questioning that.
Important. Yeah, that's so important. So how well defended is it? You say it's a strong tool for defend. Well, to what extent? I mean, how do I defend my freedom of thought?
Well, that's interesting. As I say, it's very strongly protected in international human rights law. But one of the things that we see today, we're seeing it in the US with questions about Roe v. Wade. We're seeing it in the UK with questions about the Human Rights Act today. You know, human rights and human rights law globally is under threat like possibly no other time since it was brought in the 1940s and 50s. So in that context, how we protect the right to freedom of thought goes with the wider question of how do we protect human rights? How do we protect the rule of law? The right to freedom of thought hasn't been used very often in the courts or almost at all. The one case I came across related actually to behavioral microtargeting, which was the Spanish Constitutional Court case, where they found that the collection and use of data by political parties for profiling and targeting was unconstitutional. And they considered that both from a privacy perspective, but they also looked at it from an ideological freedom perspective, which is the sort of Spanish constitutional version. So that's the one example I've come across. But it is about, you know, starting to use it, I think, in the courts to understand where the parameters are. Sorry, we're getting the dog now.
Okay. My little doggy's just right here.
The limits are of the protection. So while it's protected, absolutely, you then have to ask, well, where is the line around this in a space? What is it exactly that's protected? Yeah. Absolutely. And I think we'll start to get to that when legislators start looking at it and when the courts start looking at it in detail.
Because it might be just me. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but it feels a little bit ill-defined and like, where's the case law you use? How do we follow to defend this as a right around the world? Then, I mean, you found that one case in Spain, which is really important that there's precedent in international law, but, of it being acted upon and used. But also, I mean, I don't think that makes it easy for people to just find a human rights lawyer and say, hey, I'm being violated. How do we take this to the court? It's not a straightforward defense or way of protecting oneself. And I think that, it's something that also legislators seem to be even overlooking. I don't think they're even that aware, unfortunately.
No. I mean, in some places, though, things are shifting. So, one thing which I was really delighted about last year, the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child issued a general comment on the rights of the child in the digital environment. And I think that was probably the first international sort of explanation of international law, if you like, that clarified how the right to freedom of thought might be engaged in this digital environment. And so they started to look at practical examples. So we now do have, a legal document explaining how the Convention on the Rights of the Child, right to freedom of thought, should be understood in this digital environment. So things are definitely shifting. And we've seen a lot of analysis from UN special rapporteurs. So last year, the UN special rapporteur on freedom of religion and belief wrote what I think was the first rapporteur's report focusing specifically on freedom of thought, including aspects in the digital space. And we've seen UN special rapporteurs on freedom of opinion and expression, both the current one, Irene Khan, and her predecessor, David Kay, exploring what freedom of opinion means and that inner freedom in that context. So we are seeing this kind of commentary and jurisprudence growing in this area, and increasingly academics looking as well at these questions. So I feel as though, from a starting point where when I first looked at it, there was one article that I could find on the right to freedom of thought in relation to neuroscience and the criminal justice system. So not in the bigger sphere on that very specific thing. Mm-hmm. I couldn't find anything else. And, one of those things that possibly being a woman, you don't find it, so you think I must be wrong. And luckily, I had friends and colleagues who, when I talked to them about it, said, no, you're right. You must, you must start writing it. You must start talking about it. And certainly in the last 5 years, it's, it's starting to shift. And it will start to shift when people bring cases and legislation as well. They don't necessarily need to have freedom of thought at the front end. You can be looking at interpretation of data protection law in the light of principles of human rights law. And that's where you start discussing it. So, for example, looking at the use of mental health data and sale of mental health data, it's privacy, it's data protection, but it's also freedom of thought. It's also mental integrity. And you start having those kind of questions about how to deal with it with a more holistic view.
Wow. Well, I'm so glad you're pioneering on this. This is fantastic and so important. I just want to urge our viewers, if anybody does want to post a comment or a question. Oh, we've got one come through already.
Okay.
So Ina Van Wyk is asking, would you say the church violated the rights of indigenous populations in the Americas in this regard with the residential schools? I think that might be in relation to sort of Canada and, the horrifying revelations that have been coming out.
I think it's a very interesting question, and quite possibly, and as you mentioned at the start, Emma, in my book, the first half of the book is actually looking at the history and how we didn't have really a right to freedom of thought or freedom of thought for millennia. And one of the big areas that I looked at was around the church and sort of church control and church failure to accept differences of opinion. And the only area really where the European Court of Human Rights has looked at this sort of line around the forum internum and where the difference is between legitimate influence and persuasion and manipulation is in relation to religious proselytism, and sort of saying there is a line, although, having said that in the case, they don't really look in great detail as to what exactly that line is. And that, again, I think will develop through case law, but saying, there's a difference between preaching and brainwashing. And, so where is that line? But I think, in certain examples of that type that's being mentioned, it may well be an argument, whether it's about the right to freedom of religion and belief and right to freedom of thought, but potentially that coercive manipulation of somebody's inner life, quite possibly. It doesn't have to be through technology. It could be in many different ways.
And in many ways, this also, of course, protects mistaken beliefs and things like this, which is a really important point to make when we're talking about responding to things like disinformation and misinformation, and why we might want to separate these things and treat them differently. Do you have any comments on that?
I suppose, again, it goes back to this question of coercive manipulation, I suppose. And one of the things that I think is important to bear in mind in the disinformation and misinformation space is it's not about the content. It's about the way information is curated and personalized and fed to you in a way that somehow sort of manipulates the way you're feeling and the way you're thinking. So it's not, it's not me telling you something that's incorrect. It's about the system. That's what I think we need to look at when we're considering these issues in relation to freedom of opinion.
Yeah, absolutely.
Pardon?
It's how coercive it is and manipulative. There are degrees of manipulation and different methods that might be being deployed deliberately in some cases. And I think getting a handle on that is really important because, falsehood, even if it's, unintended, might well be, still harmful or damaging. It's in a completely different league if it's something unintended than if it is something that's intentional and being used as some kind of weapon to, shut down our ability to see things independently.
Absolutely. And I sort of feel it's like comparing, the bloke in the pub talking rubbish who you can just ignore, and he might get kicked out if he tips over into inciting hatred, as opposed to being shut in a room with information that is being targeted and curated specifically to sort of break into your mind. And that they're two very different things. It's not about the content, it's about that context, I think.
Yes. So do any of the solutions that are being proposed that we're seeing to tackle disinformation and misinformation threaten this right, in your view?
I'm not sure that they necessarily threaten it, but I think they don't really protect it. So we see this duality between freedom of expression and privacy and sort of everybody, going at it, or freedom of expression and safety. And they're not really getting to this systemic problem of twisting people's minds. Doing content moderation, even potentially the sort of amplification questions, it starts to look at it. But if you look at this information ecosystem from a holistic perspective and from the perspective of freedom of opinion, you need freedom of information in order to form your opinions freely. Yeah. And you also need freedom of expression because you need to be able to exchange your opinions in order to develop your opinions. It's not that you're born with an opinion and you stick with it for the rest of your life. That's not what freedom of opinion or freedom of thought is about.
No.
But I feel that is what is missing in many of the debates, is this holistic understanding of the right, and with a focus on making sure that we have free, uncorrupted information flows that are not coercive, that are not.
Are you there? It's breaking up a little bit.
Yeah, I am. But
I apologize if there was.
Sorry, you froze there. Sorry.
Sorry. So I was wondering, you say in your book, we don't need no thought control. So what do we need? What are the solutions to this? I know you think that policymakers and decision makers need to be thinking about this. But what, in practical terms, should they be doing to protect this important right?
It's complicated. I'm not going to say it's totally straightforward, but there are a few things that I think they can start doing. And I actually think we're going in the right direction now. I think we might get there in the next 5 or 10 years. The biggest one, I think, is banning surveillance advertising. Yeah. Not that surveillance advertising is the whole problem, but I think it's a big driver. I think it's the big financial driver of the problem. So if you say you can't do surveillance advertising, then the reason that's there for collecting all this data, or one of the big financial reasons for collecting data and manipulating people, falls away. Mm-hmm. So that's one thing I think they could do. Another thing, in relation to recommender algorithms and this idea that we're sort of being fed information based on inferences about who we are and what we want. That as well, I think we should always only opt in to recommender algorithms. It should never be automated. And I think most of us don't realize, and it's not that obvious, how to get out of the loop. Yeah. And we sort of have this impression that we've got free access to information, but actually we haven't. We're being fed. So I think in this sort of online environment, those are probably the two biggest things that could be changed. Other things include, banning emotional AI spaces, for example. Yeah. So just saying there are certain things that you can't do. And I think if we take these quite radical steps, what will happen is that we will shift the direction of tech innovation. It won't stop tech innovation. It'll just mean that we're resetting and we're going in a different direction.
Well, we don't seem to have that happening, and we seem to be heading for the metaverse, if Mark Zuckerberg has anything to do with it. So what do we need to be doing as concerned citizens to try to make this happen, to try to, create these changes, which seem at the moment to be fantastical? But of course, we never had any human rights for millennia, So what do we need to do to make this a reality?
Well, I would say defend human rights generally. That's the first thing. Make sure that, you are asking your politicians, demanding your politicians respect human rights and the rule of law, which, has nothing to do with tech. That's just basic. Once you've got that, then you can work on human rights in the tech space. Support digital rights organizations and complain about things. I know it sounds very boring to say complain, but, complain. And there are a lot in certain countries, I mean, like in the UK, and in Europe, you can complain to your heart's content. I mean, you can make a full-time job of complaining about things. So, make it a problem.
People often do over their cups of tea, I'm sure.
Absolutely. Yeah. Make it a problem. That's what I would say. So you don't have to solve everything, but what you can do is get behind the activists, the advocates that are. Put your vote with people who are going to protect human rights and protect digital rights, and don't separate the two. Don't think one thing is a complicated tech issue and the other thing is, tree hugging human rights people. It's, they all come together for our future. And I think it's important to support that, respect that, recognize it, and demand it from our politicians.
Great. What a way to end. And also, I think to add on to this, also, please, everybody share this episode so people can hear about this. Buy the book.
Yeah.
And subscribe. We talk about all of this and we're trying to raise awareness here. So please share the message that we're putting out today. Thank you so much for joining me on the show, Susie. I just want to end by saying what's going on next. In the next episode, because I have a very special guest who is going to be joining me, who is going to be talking about, after a 30-year military career in Canada, specialized in public affairs. Brett Boudreau is going to be coming on to talk about his new manuscript, which is looking at the rise and fall of strategic communication in the military, specifically in Canada. There have been a lot of controversies going on in Canada over public affairs and how that's changing, and strategic communication, and how militaries are adapting to respond to information war. These are changes that are going on around the world. And it's really important to be thinking about how democracies are responding to these kinds of threats that we're seeing, emerge at the moment. Brett has served in the Canadian Armed Forces for 30 years and has worked at National Defence Headquarters, NATO HQ in Brussels, and he's has a very extended career in this kind of area. So I'm looking forward to asking him about all of these changes that are taking place. So please, in 2 weeks, make sure that you tune in to hear my chat with Brett. And thank you again so much, Susie, for coming on today. Thank you for everybody in the audience for watching, and please don't forget.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been fun.
All right, bye everyone. Bye, Susie.
Bye, thank you.
Okay, it stopped.
Okay. Sorry, my